Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Stoa, another edition of our January Sensemaker in Residence series with Evan McMullen called The Bridge. And these are deep dives. So Evan, each week he's going deep into a topic related to the bridge. And this week I'm really excited for because it's about Communitas, something that I personally cannot shut up about. And a lot of people in this space are excited about. So this is going to be a 90-minute session. Evan's going to share his thoughts, and then it's going to be Q&A. This is your first time here. You put your question in your chat, call on you, unmute yourself, ask your question to Evan, and this will be on YouTube. So if you don't want to be at YouTube, I'll read it on your behalf. So that being said, Evan, how's it going, my friend?
Going great. Glad to be here again. This session should be fun. Yeah, I'll go ahead and just jump right into it if you want. If you can give my computer screen share permissions, and I'll go ahead and start sharing that. Share. All right. So let's get this show on the road. All right, so today we're going to be talking about Communitas and the way the bridge might relate to this. So I subtitled this deep dive Tensegrity and mutual support. So we'll get into those dynamics also, which I think is a kind of an interesting take on the whole community topic. So we've talked before in the bridge sessions about the idea of sangha. And so this is a very generalized usage of the word sangha. This isn't a pointer specifically at the Buddhist notion of sangha, but the more generalized notion of sangha as a community of practitioners coming together. And so I think sanghas are close to necessary for support and knowledge quests, as we've discussed in some of the previous bridge sessions, including especially knowledge quests based on this sort of phenomenological self-inquiry, like we've been talking about for as a frame for the bridge. When we take a look at what does being in a sangha really do? Well, it seems to have to do with a sense of what's often called communitas. Communitas is a concept that's thrown around a lot in these spaces that I'm frequenting online these days, of the Stoa adjacent spaces. So what is that concept pointing at? Well, one way to kind of think about this is that it's the opposite of alienation, in the sense that, say, Marx uses the word alienation. It's defined by, I think, Victor Turner as involving intense feelings of togetherness and belonging. And it's been studied and is often operationalized or achieved through the use of ritual, group psychotechnologies. So, and I just want to make a note here that as an inherently social species, it seems to me that we're unlikely to make much progress along any real developmental axes without a sangha or a sense of communitas surrounding that effort. There's this phrase that goes around in personal development circles a lot, you are the average of your 5 closest friends. And while there's some research that shows that it's not quite that simple, this is pointing at something quite important and quite real. You're the average of your 5 closest friends, plus your extended community, plus some people you haven't even met that are connected to you fairly closely on the social graph. So we take a look at developmental levels, individuals, and groups. So there's this sort of paradox that comes up where we want to improve our own sense-making abilities. We want to advance through whatever developmental stages are out there, whether we take the frame of something like the Keegan stages, like we've been working with here, if we take a frame of spiral dynamics or any of the other sort of staged models of adult development. Well, the paradox comes in that we, as a social species, seem to have pretty strong evolved aversions to making meaning in ways that are very different from our close associates. If you were in a human group for most of our history as anatomically modern humans, then it would be a generally very bad idea for you to have very different ways of evaluating your experiences and making meaning and than your associates would. This would mark you as not a member of the in-group. So this was bad, and we evolved a pretty strong innate reflex against things like that. So Therefore, if we're going to try to make some sort of developmental progress, it likely needs to be in the context of a group. And again, this is the importance of the Sangha aspect. So some examples of a bridge from stage 3 to stage 4 given by Keegan and reiterated by David Chapman in his article that I kicked this series off with. One of those bridges is participation in a systematic institution. So stage 3, the communal mode, moving into stage 4, the systematic mode of relating to meaning. Well, the way that a lot of people did this historically was through education and in a systematic institution of higher education, or through just going and getting a job. You know, it used to be far more common in the Western world that you'd get a job with a large corporation and you'd work for that same company until retirement, the old ideal of the company man. And these organizations were very much stage 4 systematic organizations. So this brings us to a problem that there aren't that many groups which offer the social support to move to what we've been using the language of stage 5 to sort of crudely point at. And there's a trick here. It seems that most of the institutions or organizations that seem to be about this sort of thing usually end up being about a sort of stage 3 rejection of systematicity. And it can be difficult to tell this from the outside. And this is often despite the best efforts of the founders or leadership of such groups. So we'll go into some of the reasons why that might be the case in a little bit. Part of this has to do with what I call small and larger group feedback dynamics. So there seems to be a similar phenomenon that I just described with individuals needing a sort of social support to move through developmental stages. There seems to be a similar phenomenon between subgroups and society at large. So what do I mean by this? Well, I kind of think of these smaller groups as getting pulled into a sort of orbit around the Overton window of society, a sort of social gravitation phenomenon. And so it's also just unlikely that you or I or anyone would have really heard of a group that has sufficiently different values or ways of meaning making from our macro society because, well, it's outside of the Overton window. How are we going to hear about it? Now, the internet and things like that, new modes of communication and social organization are beginning to change this, but I do think that this dynamic is still one that mainly obtains. And so then this creates a bit of a feedback loop such that it's hard to find or to create and maintain sanghas which are working multiple levels above the macro society in terms of human development. And so to me, this suggests a strong reason for the pattern which has existed across history and across different cultures, times, and places, for this basic pattern of the exoteric, the mesoteric, and the esoteric. So there's a common pattern in sort of initiatory traditions or mystery schools or things like that. You see similar things even with some groups like, say, different forms of Freemasons, other practice like that, where the exoteric layer is the one that's in direct contact with the general public. It's the sort of public-facing facade of an organization. Then the mesoteric layer involves people that have had some degree of commitment to the organization and its values, and gone through some sort of shared initiation. And the esoteric or sort of inner or secret layer is the real inner core of the organization, where by that point, because there's a pretty big shared group commitment, you may be able to operate from ways of meaning making that are quite different from the society in which you're embedded in. And so these come from Greek roots for outside, middle, and inside. So this is just a sort of pattern you see repeated pretty much across history. So I want to talk about, so I titled this section Tensegrity and Mutual Support. So I'm going to talk about the mutual support aspect first. So it seems that a main function of sanghas is to socially reinforce ways of meaning making which are not commonly held in the macro society. You know, from my own experience, say in Buddhist sanghas, you know, looking at things in terms of attachment and aversion and clinging and equanimity and so on. Well, that's pretty hard to kind of hold yourself to just by reading some books. So it's very useful to have a community of other practitioners that are, you know, relating to their lives and to meaning in similar ways. And so this involves the use of social pressure dynamics. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is worth watching closely. This goes wrong fairly often and leads to what I call cult dynamics, where the particular meaning-making methods of the group are held to be superior to those of the broader society in a pretty universal way, and it gets nasty pretty fast. And so I would say that insularity of groups is generally not a positive, since it cuts off this sort of pressure release valve of being able to go and relate to the rest of society. So it's important that, say, these, esoteric, exoteric, mesoteric layers have some degree of a semi-permeable membrane between them, so that you can move in and out of these layers and not kind of be restricted, not have a ratchet effect where you get increasingly socially isolated from your broader society. And so sanghas with that pattern do offer a sort of partial solution to the inability to diverge too far from the macro society consensus. And again, the sort of dark side or shadow side of that is that it makes you more prone to cult dynamics. So tensegrity is a term that was coined by Buckminster Fuller. It's a combination of the words tension and integrity. I put a shot here of the largest tensegrity bridge in the world. It's a pretty cool structure. Just thought that was pretty. So here, I want to talk about tensegrity in a little bit more detail. So if we're going to look at group dynamics, we could say that mutual support dynamic, where we can sort of socially pressure ourselves and each other into new ways of making meaning, making sense of the world. Then if that's the sort of integrity aspect of tensegrity, what's the tension? Well, I've reproduced again here this quote from Sex Ecology and Spirituality by Ken Wilber, which I find to be quite useful. It's where we talked about the 3 strands of any valid knowledge quest. We went over this in the first bridge session, but I want to focus in on the communal confirmation or refutation. He says, you could be mistaken unless you check your results, your data, with others who have completed the first 2 strands. That is the injunction and then the apprehension. And then in this community of peers, you can compare and confirm or reject your original idea. And this is the 3rd strand, communal confirmation or refutation. And so specifically, I want to home in on the communal refutation. To me, this is one of the major providers of the tension aspect of tensegrity when we talk about tensegrity and community structures. Come on. So to continue with this metaphor, mutual support is provided through this felt sense of communitas, and that's the integrity in the tensegrity metaphor here. So rituals are in general designed or evolved to amplify this felt sense of communitas, and of course the shadow of this is when you get cult dynamics. And then the tension is provided by this sort of requirement or encouragement that everyone in the sangha, in the community, participate as fully as they can in all 3 strands of the knowledge quest. So we don't just take the injunction, we don't just do the thing ourselves and get the results, but we also come together and discuss the ways in which the community's knowledge needs to be evolved, it needs to be changed, it needs to be updated based on the combination of all of our results. So not just taking what the founder of some technique or some community says as gospel, but actually, going through and contributing in a somewhat critical way to this knowledge quest. So when this is not the case, it's not agreed upon by the group, it's not enforced by the group, then the tendency towards cult dynamics, I think, tends to increase. Science as a societal knowledge quest does seem to do this fairly well over time. There's some issues we could talk about with generations and paradigm shifts and so on, but by and large, it doesn't do a bad job. And you want to be aware in terms of communities focused on mutual self-development of what David Chapman calls Mops in his article, Geeks, Mops, and Sociopaths, where he talks about scene and subculture evolution. Here's a quote from that article. They show up to have a good time and contribute as little as they reasonably can in exchange. So this is not what we want for a community of practitioners working on improving themselves, each other, and society. Contributing as little as they reasonably can, not a good look, because we need people to participate in all 3 strands of the knowledge quest, including the community confirmation and refutation. Not just saying, oh, cool, your knowledge quest is great, and I'm a big fan of it. Well, no, we need you to actually participate. So MOPS is an acronym that he pulled, apparently more common in the UK. It stands for members of the public. Apparently a slightly non-standard usage in the US. And so we want to beware the temptation for turning into what David Chapman calls in that article a subculture as opposed to a scene. Subcultures in this case tend to be a greater than Dunbar number of people. So, more than 150, 200 people tops. And I really don't think that we seem to have evolved or developed the right group psychotext yet to deal with greater than Dunbar scale communities without them becoming nearly worthless for real personal stage development. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the existing communities in this space and some of their observable failure modes. So most of these existing communities founded around some aspect of human development, whether it's spiritual or psychological, psycho-spiritual, psychosocial, what have you. These communities seem to often have too much of the mutual support or the integrity side of tensegrity and not enough tension. The ones that have fallen into the failure mode of too much tension, well, presumably we've never heard of them because they didn't hold together very well and didn't get publicized. And so then these tension and integrity dynamics here do have some interesting connections to, say, looking at the emptiness and form non-duality, or the pattern and nebulosity non-duality, as David Chapman puts it in a lot of his writing. You can think of the tension as having to do with emptiness or nebulosity, and the integrity as having to do with the form or pattern. So some of the subtypes of these failure modes are when we don't allow or we discourage tension with the founders or teachers. So this is what I would sort of summarize as dogmatic or guru style groups. Also prizing a superficial consensus or agreement, denying the formation of natural or context specific ephemeral hierarchies. Ken Wilber has a term for this. He calls boomeritis Buddhism, which is quite an interesting read if you find some of his articles on that. David Chapman also has quite a few things to say along these lines in his series on Buddhism on his Vividness website. And we also can talk about the tyranny of structurelessness, which is an essay later turned into a book by Joe Friedman. So the tyranny of structurelessness is essentially this concept that human groups will always have or exhibit some sort of structure and some sort of hierarchy. So when you have an explicitly structureless or non-hierarchical group, what you're actually doing is you're driving that structure sort of underground into the subterranean, where it's less legible. And what is less legible is less corrigible. Corrigible here meaning correctable. Yeah, so as Aaron just said in the chat, into the shadow. It drives it into the shadow, precisely. So, and this is tricky because it can seduce newcomers into the group. And then they're only able to clearly see the hierarchy after they've already become socially enmeshed and committed to the group, at which point it can be difficult to leave. So these groups which claim to be structureless or non-hierarchical are almost always operating from within the Keegan framing, a Keegan stage 3 place rather than a stage 5 place, even and especially when they claim the opposite. And it's also a big warning sign that the group will tend to be dominated by cluster B personality types. So this would be your category of, narcissism, borderline, sociopathy, etc., because these are the types which tends to thrive when the structure and hierarchy are illegible, because that plays to the strengths of those particular personality types. And this is generally considered not to be a positive thing for group dynamics. So I have some suggestions towards newer and more interesting failure. I can't say that these are suggestions towards success because I don't really know what that would even look like, but these are some suggestions that might move us into more interesting spaces of failure, at least. So something that I would describe as avoiding the insularity of mastery. I think that the concept of a master should probably not apply to anyone, only specializing in some sort of nebulous personal development type stuff, whether this is psychological or spiritual or what have you. Eliezer Yudkowsky of Less Wrong mentions this in his sequence on the craft and the community. I have a quote from him here. That is, you can't respect someone as a rationality instructor more than you would respect them if they were not rationality instructors. So rationality here could be seen as one of these vague, sort of nebulous personal development type concepts. And I think this is a key insight here. It's critically important. You should not respect somebody just because they seem like they're super good at rationality. They should be able to point at other more tangible, more concrete successes that they have gained through their practice of rationality, rather than just saying, oh, look at me, I'm so developed as a rationalist. And you could substitute this for various forms of psychological or spiritual development, I think, as well. If you don't do that, then you sort of avoid reality testing for the benefits of this type of development. If it's some nebulous thing that you have to commit to for several years and you don't have anything to point to see, oh, well, what are the people that are masters of this good at? Oh, they're good at this thing. Well, it becomes kind of hard to figure out what's actually going on here. And there's also, again, the tendency to fall into weird cult-like dynamics as you then, since you've invested time in whatever the practice or the community is, need to justify that sunk cost to yourself. And then you get into a weird cult-like dynamic as well. So I also think that it's important that sanghas must form connections and exchanges with other sanghas. Vince Horn talked about this on the Stoa fairly recently in terms of his meta-sangha concept. I think this is really important because this can prevent several different failure modes. This can prevent the failure mode of our system is the best and everyone else is just deluded, which you see a lot across different systems of personal development or spirituality. It also means that what is developed in general must be somewhat useful, because if your sanghas are in touch with other sanghas working different approaches, then you're going to lose members in a sort of marketplace dynamic if what you're giving people is not actually that useful. And also, I think it's important because I don't think that paths, in the sense that we discussed paths in the first bridge session, are universally generalizable. And what I mean by this is that I think that which paths are going to work for us are probably contingent on our own personal histories, on our cultural conditioning, on any number of other factors. And so it's important to have some sort of semi-permeable membrane such that people can know of and migrate between different sanghas, which might be useful to them based on where they're at right now, where they're coming from culturally, and maybe even as they develop into a new version of themselves, then a different sangha is going to resonate more. And that should be encouraged rather than a sort of lifelong commitment to one way of looking at personal development. I also think it's important that success rates should be public. An unsuccessful experiment should be viewed with skepticism. You know, this is a criticism you see made in the sort of like awakening or enlightenment communities a lot, that people talk a lot about this stuff, but really like, okay, for teacher X, how many people that they have worked with as students can they point to and say, okay, this guy's now enlightened because of my teachings, right? You know, or what have you. There's a sort of really fuzziness when it comes to getting some real talk about what's actually being developed in these practices, and how successful are we doing at passing that on to others? Or is this just maybe our founder is a sort of unique freak of nature and they figured something out, but they have no ability to teach it? That's another sort of common failure mode. And so I think that people should more or less publish their success rates. If you join our sangha, then if you put in this much work over this many years, you've got this probability of getting to whatever it is that we're offering. So some positive trends I see in these spaces. So I think that some of the spaces around here, like the Stoa itself, Interintellect, Noetic Nomads, these are all sort of interesting, what I would call proto-metasanghas. They have representatives of many different views, approaches, and paths with respect to personal and group development. If you're a regular in these spaces, you're likely to have many of your sacred cows gored. It's hard to stay in a sort of parochial and isolated view on what personal development, what spiritual development, what social development looks like, because so many people from different perspectives and different traditions are coming into these sort of proto-meta-sangha spaces to share their takes on things. And also, within a lot of these spaces, the leaders or the teachers or the masters can be questioned. And since we're not in their sangha proper, then they can't just retreat behind their social authority when questioned. There's an opportunity to engage in some real dialogue. Also in these spaces, there are some really interesting group psychotechs that are kind of all being practiced widely and evolving. I think this is very cool. We've got things like the glass bead game, collective presencing, EGP, theory U, circling, social meditation, other things that I'm forgetting about right now. And I see this as a very encouraging development. I think this is very cool. And I think that updated group psychotechs that aren't stuck in frameworks inherited from the Middle Ages or earlier are going to be crucially important for human development over the next decades, and that this is a really cool and fruitful area of research that's going on in these spaces. And I also think that these will be important research areas in the sense of the group psychotech for what I would call the reinvigoration of ritual practice. So earlier we talked about how the communitas, especially when the term is used in anthropological circles, is associated with a sense of, and hey, could whoever's writing on my slides maybe not do that? So anyway, communitas is associated with ritual in the anthropological literature. So I want to suggest that we can move towards what I would call a meta-modern ritual technology. So to those of us who reached a sort of Keegan stage 4 kind of place through the STEM bridge, as I've discussed in some of the previous sessions, old-timey rituals can kind of seem a little bit quaint, hokey, and for these reasons can be kind of ineffective. So we can't just go and become pre-modern again, right? That doesn't seem to be a viable path forward. So there's also a really intense interest or hunger in the in these spaces for group psychotech and for ritual and for the experience of communitas. This is something that we talk about a lot in these spaces. And so I think that these group psychotech practices are like really good research and kind of a gold mine, especially when we combine that with the sort of practice and perspective that's been suggested by some of the recent conversations surrounding the topic of ontological design. To me, this combination or this synthesis suggests the potential for a sort of open source community designed ritual, which can be iteratively improved on in the same manner as other open source technologies. So we can kind of fork and clone and pull request our way to a religion that's not a religion. We can, with the perspective of ontological design, potentially avoid the trap of being stuck in the ontologies of others because of our participation in rituals that we've inherited without understanding them. So I think that this is a really interesting and fruitful area that's kind of on the cutting edge of what we as humans are working with in terms of psychotech. You know, most of the ritual that I've been a part of, even the stuff that's really worked for me, has essentially been, you know, inherited from basically medieval traditions. And it'd be super cool to see what all of the people, you know, working in these spaces are going to collectively come up with over the next few years as far as turbocharging our own individual practices and our sense of communitas through, you know, sort of open source ontologically designed ritual. That just seems like it's got a lot of potential. So as usual, I've included some at the end here, some suggestions for recommended resources to look more into the topics that were discussed here. So I've got The Evolving Self by Keegan, Ria Beck's wonderful book on collective presencing, The Disappearance of Rituals, which was recommended to me recently and which is a phenomenal book. Living Together, another great book, looking at a sort of Roland Barthes style perspective with several different essays on this topic. The Evolving Ground, the community that Jared and Charlie are putting together, looking at the reinvention of Buddhist Tantra is really cool and a great example of people working together to construct new ways of approaching these topics. The Craft in the Community, the Less Wrong sequence by Eliezer Yudkowsky that I pulled that quote from is pretty cool as well, as far as offering some insights into many of the possible failure modes, especially surrounding cult dynamics and unprovable assertions and things like that. Obviously, David Chapman's work, Meaningness, has a lot of stuff on the topic of community and group meaning and sense making. The Nature of Order by Christopher Alexander, author of A Pattern Language, is a phenomenal exploration into a lot of these topics, especially the way that our sense of community dynamically interacts with the individual and the environment. And then finally, to again avoid a lot of the failure modes, I can't recommend The Strategy of Conflict by Thomas Schelling highly enough. And so I will go ahead and stop the presentation at this point, and we can go ahead and move into a Q&A, and I will share the link to the presentation for future reference in the comments.
Beautiful. So start throwing your comments in the chat, and I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself, or your questions, I should say. So I'll warm you up with a question, Evan. Sexual and romantic attractions and tension and drama in these communities, you know, mate competition, all that type of stuff. What is your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. So obviously that's going to be a thing that happens. I just don't see it as realistic that we're going to have human groups where that is not a thing. Or maybe I should say we might have human groups where that's not a thing if everybody takes a vow of celibacy. I mean, this is essentially the function of monasteries and convents, is to tamp down on those dynamics as much as possible. But as we know now, that also doesn't tend to work very well. for a variety of reasons, and also seems to be somewhat incompatible with most people's desired way of living in the world. So I think that's a big source of potential conflict in these communities. But I think that also, I mean, as we get better at this stuff together, we also, I think, get better at navigating those dynamics. And this is going to be messy. You know, I personally advocate for a sort of, you know, personal practice wise, and what I think is appropriate for this moment in our culture. I advocate for what could be viewed as a sort of tantrically inflected type of practice, similar to what Jared and Charlie are talking about on the Evolving Ground. Now, Tantra does not mean all about sex here. It means engaging with those things which may limbically hijack us, which may trigger extremely strong emotional responses in us, and remaining with those responses and observing them to learn more about ourselves, rather than you know, trying to suppress them, repress them, or avoid them. So I think that, you know, the whole dynamics around competition, mate selection, sexuality in general with respect to these sorts of groups give rise for really interesting opportunities for practice. And, you know, there's also a sort of sense of, I guess you would say maybe mutual forgiveness or mutual holding that can be necessary, where we don't expect perfection from each other. And, you know, again, coming from a sort of Buddhist inflected lens here, I'm inclined to emphasize the virtues of understanding impermanence and understanding the impersonal or not self nature of phenomena. I think that this can also be languaged in a sort of stoic way as well, Peter, you know, where we endeavor as a sort of community agreement to not take the shit personally. And that's very hard, but if we can support each other in doing so, then maybe we can come into right relationship with this stuff together.
And a related question, I know in Europe, there's like an emergence of like the men's movement, like Rebel Wisdom. They had men's retreats and stuff like that. Do you think there's a space in a Sangha or a community to have, you know, groups of the sexes together where they can relate and do their thing or whatever?
Absolutely. Even when you're talking a tantrically inflected style of practice, I think this is actually, you know, I'm surprised I didn't put this in the presentation, actually. This is one thing that if I had to identify what I see as some of the things that were missing that older societies had more of, or older versions of our society, I would say that like single, or, you know, like sex segregated affinity groups are probably a really good thing. And we probably need more of that. We probably need to bring that back a little bit, you know, men's groups, women's groups. And it doesn't have to just be the two standard, you know, men and women. You have groups for various different forms of gender expression and identity. That's great. But the point is that takes a lot of those sexual dynamics that you were mentioning out of the picture, at least for most people. And I think can be really, really valuable. And, you know, we could slice that up in a number of different ways, but I think we really miss something when we don't have something like that going on. I'm curious what your take on that is too.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. And it sort of expresses different, you know, muscles, interpersonal muscles, if you're relating with a bunch of men from my experience. The other question I had, and then we'll pivot to the Q&A, a power literacy. Because I have a bunch of friends that they're telling me they're going to this place or that place. I'm like, dude, you're like joining a cult. Like, be careful. So how important it is to have a power literacy of these dynamics when you're joining a group or a sangha, or even starting one or starting a community or whatever.
I think it's deeply important for people considering starting communities to have a pretty high level of power literacy. That's the reason I suggested, you know, the sort of outlier and the reading list that I put at the end of that presentation was the strategy of conflict, right? I think that that's kind of a minimal level of competence and a certain kind of power literacy, is to really read and understand the lessons of that in order to create a community that's not immediately going to have toxic game theoretic dynamics involved. And I think that for potential joining of a community, you know, and some of the stuff I was trying to gesture at with the presentation as a whole is some of these failure modes here. And, you know, just in general, I mean, power literacy is one of the areas in which our educational systems tend to do the worst, right? And you know, we could go into all kinds of theories about why, but it's like man, they don't teach you financial literacy and they don't teach you power literacy. You could view the one as a subset of another even potentially. And I think there's some distinct reasons why they don't. But that being said, I think that that's an important thing for people to work on and become aware of, power, literacy with it, and especially establishing a relationship with power and hierarchy where you don't just have like an UGG field around it. You know, you don't just feel icky about it, because like we talked about in this sort of mention of the tyranny of structurelessness, there's going to be power dynamics. There's going to be hierarchy. There's going to be structure. Whether or not the group claims that there is, whether or not this is, you know, explicit, that's going to be present. And you have to be able to sort of read those dynamics a little bit, at least be, if you're not a literate speaker of power, at least being a literate reader of power, so to speak, is very useful from any practitioner's standpoint, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. Aaron, you had a question on hierarchy.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. What's the proper structure of an explicit hierarchy? We're talking about the tyranny of structurelessness. So let's say we do have an explicit hierarchy in a community. What is the proper structure of that hierarchy? How is it established? And how does it stay healthy rather than move towards natural tyranny?
I don't know that there is one proper structure, first of all. I mean, I'm a big fan of sort of some degree of mutual consent for things. So I think that, you know, the structure and hierarchy should probably be subject to periodic revision. That strikes me as an attribute of healthy organizations. There's also, I think, the importance of different potentially overlapping layers or stacks of hierarchy, right? You know, you take a look at some, say, indigenous cultures that have different hierarchies or different chiefs for, say, war and, you know, peace or what have you, right? You know, where you have dynamics where it's not one centralized hierarchy, it's hierarchies that form somewhat naturally based upon observed competence, and then the structure comes into interrelating and navigating between the competing needs of those hierarchies, right? So, for example, we may have a desire to do project X as a group, and we may also have a desire to do project Y as a group. And it's generally fairly apparent to the people in the group who's most qualified to contribute to each of those efforts. The need for more formal structure and hierarchy then comes in when the group wants to do both of those things, and you have to apportion resources somehow between the two of them because they are in that sense in some kind of conflict. And so I think there's all kinds of novel approaches to this, some of which have been talked about on the STOA and lots of which I'm fans of. And I think experimentation is needed in this area for sure, because I don't feel qualified to say, oh, this is the right kind of hierarchy. I mean, I think the sort of bog standard, top down traditional, we've got a guy at the top, we've got some lieutenants, we've, you know, kind of pyramid structure where one hierarchy is responsible for everything is pretty much a bad idea. But beyond saying that, and then also saying that a structureless organization is one, impossible, and two, a bad idea, somewhere in the middle there. And I think that we're currently in the middle of a lot of interesting experiments in this space. And, you know, it's also helpful, I think, to read some of the histories of intentional community and other organizations like this, you know, not just the salacious presentations you'll see for Netflix and so on, but to go and read some of the more sympathetic histories of places like the farm, other, you know, intentional communities, and see what went right and what went wrong there, and mine those for inspiration and cautionary tales.
Thanks, Evan.
Cool. All right, so since we're on the thread of power, let's go with Adam, who just posted a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. I wanted to ask how to solve the power design paradox, as in if you are a person in the community who is aware of these power dynamics and its problems, you have to have some certain power in the community to raise the question of power dynamics. So I wanted to ask if you know how to solve this paradox.
How is that a paradox?
Well, you have to be a power figure or have to play the power card to be able to approach the community and say like, yeah, we have a power problem. Let's set some rules of power, or let's get some norms. But then you are immediately making yourself an authority and a person of power.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see that as more of a feature than a bug, right? Because like what we were just talking about with Peter and with Aaron, you want founders of these communities or leaders in these communities to possess power literacy. So it's a sort of built-in selection mechanism that means that it's much harder for people to become leaders or founders without having power literacy. Because if you have power literacy, then attaining power in a community is a relatively trivial matter. So there's a nice little selection effect there. And then as far as the other half of the paradox there, I think that's kind of implied is like, well, what about the other people, right? Well, that's why I emphasize the importance of the sort of meta-sangha structure and the sort of, semi-permeable membrane so that we can go ahead and not get trapped in specific communities, like that it's encouraged to move between communities to some extent, right? There's a martial art I've been involved with on and off where you, excuse me, before you are licensed to teach fully, you have to go and get the equivalent of a black belt in some other martial art because no system is complete, right? And so not just allowing, but encouraging people to go sort of become parts of multiple sanghas within the same sort of meta-sangha structure, I think can help, ameliorate some of these toxic insular power dynamics. And so, I would never say, oh, you should come and listen to me. This is the light, the truth, the way, this is what I'm doing, this is it, right? And you can't listen to other people. I've left organizations that are spiritually focused, like meditation groups and so on, because they wanted me to not practice other traditions, not take on other perspectives. And I see that as being a sort of big red flag when an organization tells you, don't try out other people's approaches, don't try out other people's methods, this is it. Well, that's a big red flag and one of the basic parts of power literacy, right? So I do think that it's important to take that into account. So maybe does that give you some sort of thoughts there? You have a follow up or yeah?
Yeah, thank you. It's there's a lot of meat you gave me. I will maybe boil it down to one simple question and personalize it. I am invited to a community where there is low power literacy. I can already see, and even among the founders. So there's some sort of nebulous power hierarchy. A lot of people have this wish for having some sort of equality, but they haven't reflected on the power hierarchy. And I come there as a new member, and I see that, and I would love to help them realize that there is a power problem, or there's not enough awareness of that. But how can I suggest that from my position?
Well, I mean, that's a hard one to answer in a short amount of time. The simple answer is develop your own power literacy. And because when you do, then again, like I said, attaining some level of power or voice in a group is really easy when you can read social power dynamics. It seems impossible when you can't, but you'll watch people enter into groups and also observe the behavior of others who seem to be able to do this. They sort of enter into a social space, and within a fairly short order, they're seen as some sort of leader or thought leader, or they're associated with the elements that have the obvious legible power. There tends to be certain moves that these people make which are generalizable, and you can sort of learn through example that way. But definitely making a concerted effort to read some of the stuff, and I've seen people throwing suggestions in the chat here, many of which are good. Like Robert Greene, like Sun Tzu, like Schelling, they're the Clausewitz, Machiavelli, all the classics here. Reading those as not a guidebook on how to be a sociopath, but a guidebook on how to be power literate, I think is a powerful thing, and something that would be great if more people did it, because it helps inoculate you against the sort of sociopathic type power moves, as well as gives you some options to take up power in a more pro-social way.
Thank you.
On that note, we were talking at a previous session, Evan, about the pickup artists. I find them really great if you want to grok like kind of an in-person power, like power dynamics in a group. And they have a term called the social nexus, like kind of the person who holds the power in a group. And they have these techniques to kind of like find them, and they call it AMOG destroyers, alpha male of the group destroyers. They have all these techniques. So that's useful, I find.
Yeah, plus one to that, I mean, I found like the pickup artistry community to have a pretty grimy vibe or aesthetic, but I found a lot of their writings to be very useful in developing.
We lost you for a moment.
Sorry, yeah, somebody called me on a voice over IP line and took over the call. I apologize for that. Am I back?
All right. Did you have a point you wanted to finish off? It seemed like you got cut
Oh,
off.
sorry. I don't know where I got cut off. What I was saying is that although I had a kind of personal aesthetic revulsion for a lot of the sort of aesthetics or vibe of the pickup artist community, broadly speaking, I found engaging with their written content and some of those people to be extremely useful in developing power literacy in a way that frankly has helped me navigate like the corporate world a lot more than it's helped me navigate the romantic world. But man, are the principles generalizable, you know? So yeah, plus one of that.
Cool. Colty, you had some thoughts on queer theory and feminism.
Yeah, I can't. Let's see if I can gather these thoughts, because I cannot speak for all Black feminists or speak for all queer people. But I just find those spaces to be really interesting in questioning power and power literacy, and really asking like, what is the execution of agency and what are the consequences when people don't have agency over their choices. It's a very interesting distinction between trickle down power and grassroots organizing power, that while we're on this subject, I think is super potent for the tensegrity of communities. Frequently, because of the pushback or criticism that these particular paradigms and epistemologies run up against, because they are questioning power as it is disseminated in society. So yeah, I don't know that I had a specific question about that, but those things definitely came up for me, both when talking about power and talking about gender too, because I'm a non-binary person, but my experience is I don't get to claim I have a male or masculine experience, you know, and coming into spaces where there, in a best case scenario, isn't a level of queer analysis to understand what being non-binary means, particularly since it's not like there's a universal understanding. I often patch into places where that is either rejected out of hand or not analyzed in a neutral way. It can be very emotionally activating for people to the point that it's almost pointless to bring up. But I bring it up here because I think, frankly, I think it's interesting. And I think that there needs to be a little more engagement with you know, feminist critique and racial critique and gender critique that often gets dismissed out of hand because power doesn't disrupt itself. So those are my thoughts.
And that's great to bring in here. And thank you for doing so, because it would be deeply incomplete to talk about learning power literacy by only studying the writings on power of the powerful, because you get a whole different perspective when you study the critiques and perspectives on power of those who are or feel powerless. And there's actually an interesting connection to what Peter brought up just now, because the pickup artist community is, you know, in essence, a bunch of men who felt powerless in the dynamics of dating, right? And so, the tyranny of structuralists, which I brought up in the presentation, was written by somebody who was sharing their experience in what they called it like women's lib or feminist collectives, right? And so that's a feminist or post-feminist or something like that perspective on power and power dynamics. And certainly my own understanding of power dynamics would be much more incomplete than it is right now if I hadn't pretty deeply engaged with the writings on the subject by several different generations of civil rights activists, because there's a lot to learn there, not just the people who are, oh yes, I'm the general wielding the power like Clausewitz or somebody, but people who are trying to and who have successfully disrupted the dominant systems of power at the time, right? So, you can go into people like MLK and Gandhi here, you can go deeper, because I forget who made this point originally or where I originally learned it, but you can often learn a lot more from the failures of smart people than from their successes. You're a lot less subjected to survivorship bias. And so if you want a good map of the territory, look at the people that spent their life on something and in some sense failed. And so I found great value in looking at the analysis of power dynamics of people whose projects with social change have not yet succeeded, because you'll often find very accurate analysis there. And especially if you read several different perspectives that sort of pattern match into that category, then you'll definitely get a lot of really useful stuff on power literacy that you won't necessarily find by mining the bestseller list on like business or power dynamics, for sure.
Can I also tie into the trickster discussion that we had last week? I think it's really interesting that tricksters as disruptors of power really serve a function to disseminate power differently. That's the bridge I would put between these two bridge sessions.
Absolutely. And I mean, the trickster archetype is exactly the sort of thing which is the way that many cultures have described the dynamic that I was just talking to Adam about, right? Whereby if you have power literacy, it's relatively trivial to attain power. That's the same thing that the trickster does, right? They go from seeming powerless to seeming powerful in the blink of an eye, and they're labeled as the trickster by people that don't understand what's going on there. It seems like a trick. It seems like cheating, but it's actually not. It's simply observing the dynamics of the underlying system well enough to be able to skillfully intervene at the right leverage point, right? This goes back to the metas discussion from last week as well. And so, yeah, this is all deeply connected and very interesting stuff. I personally think that reading trickster myths, especially cross-culturally, read about Coyote, read about Anansi, read about Loki, and go and figure out how you can take some of those lessons into your personal engagement with power. I think that's a fruitful path as well.
I'll take in Nicole. She had a question related to knowledge and power, which I think is quite important, and then we'll pivot to a non-power question.
Hey, so I'm just gonna scroll up here really quickly to find my question. Yeah, okay, so I guess it's like kind of composed of two parts. So whether you believe that there is a natural correspondence between power and knowledge, in the sense that people are like gravitating towards people that do have knowledge, and whether the second part to my question is whether people that do have knowledge almost have like a certain responsibility to sort of move themselves into positions of power.
Okay, so that's a really interesting one. I do think there's obviously a deep connection between power and knowledge, especially for humans. I mean, human beings are not the strongest or fastest or any other sort of physically most able animals out there. And so the foundation for our success has been almost entirely based on our social cognitive abilities, right? Being a tribal organism that can support each other in the ways that we do. I forget, was it Margaret Mead or somebody, or someone like that said that they found that the first sign of civilization was a skeleton with a broken femur that had healed, because that would have never happened in any other species. For an animal like us, that's just a death sentence. And so the social aspects of humans are what give us our power as a species. And so, yes, there's this connection between knowledge and social cognition and power. But what I find to be kind of unfortunate is that only certain types of knowledge tends to be correlated that strongly with power. And they're not necessarily the types you would want. knowledge which is legible, people who have knowledge and are also good at expressing it verbally, people with high verbal skills, you know, the whole art of rhetoric or the whole phenomenon of sophistry, right? These, I think, are actually kind of bad things. They're the failure mode of our social cognition and our strength as a species, right? It's the double-edged sword. The other side of the coin is that often our sense of how knowledgeable someone is not that strongly correlated with how knowledgeable they actually are. So in that sense, I do think that it would be good if we had the most knowledgeable people in general having more power, but our proxies for how knowledgeable people are filtered through this verbal lens currently, and also through things like what's called the affect heuristic or the halo effect, where we automatically assume that someone, for example, who's better looking is also more intelligent, or somebody who's taller is more intelligent, like things like that. That's not such a great thing to have going on. And when you have all these little heuristics floating around in your brain, you got to be really careful about how you evaluate other people's level of knowledge, and therefore how you, based on that, promote them into positions of power. So this is one area where I think some of these group psychotechnologies, you know, that I mentioned, like the glass bead game, like collective presencing, are really useful, because I think that feeling into that we space, as people like to call it, can really help you get a sense of not just, you know, knowledge or intelligence, but also a sense of integrity, like a felt sense of how people are in the world, which I think is honestly more important for the responsible exercise of power than some level of knowledge is. And so, you know, if I had to pick one, I'd go with integrity being more important for who we want to be in power than knowledge or intelligence. But ideally, you'd have all the above.
All right. Any follow-up, Nicole?
No, that was good. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to take in Peter Jones. Peter, you had a question.
Thanks. I'm really enjoying this conversation, Evan. I have a question about how we practice the bridge to the Sangha itself. Like, what are some of the steps towards drawing communities into deeper practice without enrolling them into our est cult, or, you know, our thing? It is, so how can we create co-evolving communities that create, in essence, their early stage sanghas that can lead to something deeper? I'm interested in the idea of sangha formation, you know, and curious as to your ideas about like the entry points or early stages, how to step a community in to types of rituals. Like my question in the chat was about going beyond the land acknowledgement, like in public engagement. So can we take deeper steps, become known for kind of being encouraged in our engagements to suggest these things and to suggest there are other practices that we can engage in, and these could co-evolve. Right now, I've done some of this, but yeah, I can't describe how sometimes the magic happens. You know, so do you have a sense of how you can bridge to creating sanghas out of practice groups, how we might co-evolve the groups into deeper spaces?
That's a really big question. I have thoughts, but not a great degree of confidence about them. So this is speculation, just to be clear. I think one reason I started out the Bridge series by talking about Keegan stages, and you know, you can pick other frames to look at adult development for, is because you get some really troubling dynamics when groups are composed of disjoint developmental stages, especially like across several different stages. Because the sort of ritual, the sort of communal meaning making that works for one stage rarely works as well for the other stage, and especially because of what people call the pre-trans fallacy, can be actively a turnoff for people precisely one stage above or below the median of the group or whatever, right? So I think that this is something that's been really underexplored and it has not been sufficiently taken into account by people putting together practice groups on average historically. The fact that developmental stages are fairly real, you know, and I'm not married to any of these models, but you have to acknowledge that adult development past like who we are when we're 18, there's a lot more territory to cover in terms of our development, right? So that's a thing. And this informs group design. This informs group practice. This informs individual practice, right? And so having an awareness of human development as a thing, I think, is one of those things that has been insufficiently considered in most of the historical Sangha formations, intentional community formations, and group formations. And if you go and read histories of intentional communities, experiments in intentional living, spiritual communities, etc., you see a lot of dynamics which essentially can sort of be compressed into stage incompatibilities, then turning into strong personality conflicts and turning into separate nexuses of power, turning into tearing apart, that whole dynamic, right? So,
like the Rajneeshi community, and
there's one right there. And you've got plenty of others. I mean, ones that I've personally experienced and been a part of. So, I don't want to make people in developmental stage like lower be somehow lesser than. And maybe you can talk about this in terms of creating differing approaches, like affinity groups or something like that, where people can get a sampler of the different styles of group and community practice and gravitate towards the one that feels most right to them, which hopefully, if we do a good job of that sort of design, should be the one most correlated with, the level that they're at, while still challenging them to develop into the levels beyond where they're at. So those are some of the things that I would think about when doing this sort of design. But I've been a hermit more or less for most of a decade. So as far as practical experience in this, I only really have personal experience of failure here. So again, take everything I say with a grain of salt.
No, that's a really thoughtful answer. It's what's suggesting to me is also how you were conceiving really the dojo or the martial arts community. I mean, there are different aesthetic forms that people know about, even if they haven't practiced, and that they may be willing to accept as really as an aesthetic more than an ontology. So they aren't buying into a belief system, but they're coming into the ritual that could be formed similar to a dojo ritual or which we accept because we want to learn what's there for that development. And so I guess one of the ways of looking at this is I work a fair amount with public engagement. I know that there's also some hunger for really going deeper with some people, and some of it is also kind of the STEM barrier. There are people that will really definitely want to preserve their sense of the rational engagement, the rational aesthetic, I should say, which is important for, especially on the municipal side of some public engagements, let's say, but there is a hunger for going deeper, and we see this with indigenous talking circles and other practices. I'm wondering if we can learn from, in terms of kind of pre-sangha. I don't want to be a cult leader, but I'm just thinking there are cultural forms that we can use as these bridges, as stepping stones to deeper practice to bring more people along.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think you could look at something like the phenomena that happened around the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study as like a great thing to look at in terms of a very advanced level sort of Sangha that retained a sort of rationalist aesthetic, but also had the ability to go deeply beyond the normal limits of rationalism in the sort of way that David Chapman points to with meaningness and the eggplant. Also, somebody threw into the chat, I totally agree with this, since you brought up the dojo analogy, the idea of, say, mixed martial arts as being a sort of meta sangha for the different martial arts sanghas, and therefore getting some grounded, reality tested practice in it, where you can't just say, oh, my system's the best. No, you got to go fight that dude now, right? Martial arts are to some extent about being good at that skill, and we got to actually see how that works, bringing back dharma dueling among the different dharmic traditions, right? Not just within a tradition, but between exemplars of different traditions.
Like the Tibetan monk.
Yeah. Exactly, but instead of just having two Tibetan monks, have a Tibetan guy and a Zen guy, have a Zen guy and a Theravada guy, have any one of them and a Hindu non-dual, or Kashmiri Shaivism, or a Christian meditator, or silent prayer practitioner, or what have you. That stuff seems very cool, and this again speaks to the importance of a sort of meta sangha type interconnectedness between practitioners from different lineages and traditions and aesthetics, because the aesthetic is one thing, but you also have to be developing real abilities, or else you're just basically LARPing, right?
Cool. Thanks, Peter. Christian, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I did have a question. I kind of decided it was not a great question in the interim. It's kind of a real problem, but a bit of a niche problem. And maybe a better question is to inquire into a solution space which prevents the problem rather than tries to remedy it. So I just said a bunch of abstract shit. The question is about basically, let's say about signal games, and in today's culture, I think what I've observed is that you can send out the right, this is not a cult signal, even while there are cult dynamics at play. And so I think maybe a better question than the one I posed is like, how does one evolve, develop their discernment of signals and not get distracted or caught up in the signal that's being broadcasted? That's one question. And then another one that's kind of evolving in my mind tangentially is about the idea of metasanghas and power structures. And the question that seems to be begging itself is, what is the power structure of a metasangha? Or should there be one? And if there's not going to be one, is the solution to develop one's own sovereignty enough to be able to navigate the metasangha effectively? Like with mixed martial arts, there's not like a mixed martial arts, well, there are mixed martial arts dojos now, but even then there's not like a lineage that's a single one. It's like, it's kind of, you're on a journey through these different martial arts, and you are in a way kind of creating your own religion, spirituality path, etc. So two different questions, pick either or both or whatever.
I think they can sort of be tied together in that, so the signaling thing is part of not just being human, it's part of being an animal, right? I mean, a lot of the, even what we think of as more simpler animals out there do signaling and counter signaling and counter signaling and so on, right? And so, you know, the short answer with respect to signaling is go and read Robin Hanson until you can't stand it anymore, among other things, right? But I mean, really, like there's some interesting stuff you can look at there, but I think it's important to pay attention to the phenomena of, if I had to pull one thing out of that whole literature, it would be the phenomenon of the costly signal, right? Like a signal is likely to be a true signal in direct proportion to how costly to send that signal is, right? So things that are easy to fake, it's easy to do, probably don't mean that much. You know, is it a signal that I have a certain haircut, or that I wear a certain clothing, or that I speak certain words? No, because those have essentially no cost to me, right? Whereas if I do something that involves a significant cost or a significant opportunity cost, that's more likely to be a valid signal. Though, of course, you can counter signal by, you know, spending a lot of money to signal something that's actually not a true signal. And these dynamics get weird and tricky. And I think that, you know, being aware of them, trying to develop some literacy in them, and you know, building that into your gut, so to speak, right? Because if you have to sit here and process all of this stuff intellectually, then you get caught up in all kinds of paranoid games in your mind, and that's generally not a fun or desirable place to be in. So I would say that, again, I advocate that people spend some significant time and effort developing some lenses into power literacy, and then basically don't use those lenses consciously or rarely, if that makes sense. You know, it's sort of the same way that the rationalist like Eliezer Yudkowsky advocates that you do the Bayesian expected value calculation and then you throw it out and go with your gut. Just the simple process of like knowing those frameworks helps internalize them so that your gut gets a little bit more accurate there. And then with the metasangha thing, I think that I want to be very clear and say I'm not advocating for a single metasangha. Right. And mixed martial arts is actually a great example of this, because there's multiple different organizations which are umbrella organizations within mixed martial arts. And you can compete in 0, 1, or many of those, right? Unless you get to the really top tier. Yeah, mesh sangha. I like, exactly. Sort of think of it as a mesh, right? So I would not encourage people to buy into one metasangha. A single metasangha might have a focal coordination node, and that could be somebody who has, you know, personality defects or has, bad intentions, bad motivations, and then that could poison the whole thing. But if sanghas engage with multiple metasanghas, then that can provide some sort of redundancy, resilience against that failure mode. The same way that I personally wouldn't advocate that you just be a part of a single sangha. I also wouldn't advocate that a single sangha be a part of a single metasangha. If you look at, say, like I think Monastic Academy is doing some interesting things in this space, because on the one hand, you could say that they're part of like a sort of Buddhist inflected metasangha, but they're also a part of a separately sort of like maybe vaguely effective altruist or X-risk affiliated metasangha. And those have very different standards and very different ways of operating. And so, if you're somebody who's in that space, then maybe you have some different options as far as where you can reach out to find similar people with similar interests and similar practices. And so I think this whole, mesh or web of metasanghas is a great model to look for. I am distrustful of single points of failure in general and single centralized top of the pyramid authority structures in particular, right? I mean, I get sometimes there's a need for quick executive action, but in general, you can have multipolar power centers avoid some of those dynamics, I think. Yeah.
Any follow-up question?
Well, thanks. That was a great response. I thank you for the author recommendation. I haven't heard of that fellow before. And a little follow-up. I'm curious about the costs, I suppose, of becoming familiar with power literacy. I feel, like you said, I really appreciated your injunction of like, it's something you would want to learn, but then put away. Like, don't like hold that lens and view everything through it. That seems like its own skill, though, the ability to be able to do that. Like, it can be really hard to know how to put that lens away. And I feel like I've seen people who, once they get the lens, they it's really, yeah. So do you have any understanding of how one develops that ability to not?
Yeah, I mean,
the lens?
It's tricky, right? Is the first thing I would say. There's a real temptation to be changed in terms of your values in the process of learning power literacy. And I think that's kind of a summary of the danger you're talking about here, right? Where learning of power literacy becomes sort of infectious and infects your value system. It's like reading Machiavelli and not realizing that it's not actually for a prince, right? Or that's not its only purpose, right? Thinking, oh, so the whole thing now is I need to get to the top of the power hierarchy and use all these power literacy techniques to defend my position. Well, that's a thing I guess you could do, but it's also probably not a thing that the current version of you would be very happy to see you doing in the future, right? You have other values other than just the sheer exercise of raw power. So we could talk about not getting stuck at simulacrum level 4, where it's just all about the raw exercise of power. We could talk about the importance of grounding, both in the energetic sense and the social sense, being grounded in having good friends and family and associates who will keep you a little bit honest, the sort of deeply ingrained human egalitarian social leveling instinct, where when our friends get too uppity, we make fun of them, or we poke at them. I mean, that's something that is really useful that people do for each other, and like, it's one thing I greatly appreciate about this community around the Stoa is that I know that if I get too big for my britches, there's a bunch of people that are just going to start making fun of me, and like that they should, right? So I think that's all important here, and really just continually checking in with your values, like your integrity, your sense of what's important, and for me, this involves like life. This involves the sense of, from a sort of Buddhist frame, thinking that sentient beings suffering is bad and suffering less is good. And, like, am I operating in service to life? Am I operating in a life positive way? Or am I operating in a zero-sum, rivalrous game theory, like, let me get to the top of this limited heap kind of way? And to the extent that we start learning about power dynamics and we start viewing everything as zero-sum games, and this is really bad, right? But I think that by having, again, this is part of the importance of the sangha and the metasangha, the community, and just like our families, our friends, our small little tribes, to keep us honest and say, hey man, you've been worrying me a lot lately. I think you're losing sight of what's important, and you know, listening to people. It's really easy, especially as you start to gain knowledge that your friends don't have about specialist areas, to think you're somehow better than them, or you're somehow seeing more clearly than them. I think that's generally an error. You know, you should trust people who you care about when they say they're worried about you, and you should deeply introspect and respect their perspectives on that. And I think that that's about the best advice I've got as far as how to not get captured by the dynamics of learning power literacy.
One thing I'd add to that is Keith Johnstone, the guy who created the improv movement. I was talking to him on the phone before he came to the STOA, and he said that he was always fascinated when his students learned status dynamics. Everyone stopped playing one-upmanship, and all that bullshit, you know, just went away because they all knew each other's game. And I find in my sort of close friend circle, you know, the friendship of virtue I would have, like Daniel Kazanjian or whatnot, their power literacy game is tight. And if you're committed to an adjacent value of truthfulness, there's really nowhere to go with that. So I think when a community builds power literacy, that's why I'm so interested in the STOA growing. I think it is beneficial for the whole.
Yeah, I just want to offer a huge +1 to that, because that's something I forgot to mention, or I didn't think of. And when Christian asked me that question, is that it's much safer to not do this alone. Right? Because if you have somebody that's learning power literacy at roughly the same rate as you are, then they're going to be able to see through your newfound bullshit. You start pulling interesting and subtle status moves, they're going to notice that because they've been reading the same text you have, right? And that's a very useful check as well in the sort of friends area.
Rob Hart, you had a question.
Hey, so thank you, first of all, for like an awesome conversation and presentation. So you mentioned if we're to make developmental progress, it will likely be in the context of a group. And I noticed when you said that like, even before you said it will be in the context of a group, I'm already thinking about group developmental progress. But then I realized you probably were also referring to individual developmental progress happening and having to in the context of a group. I think both are true, but there's also some tension between those two levels. And one of them is there are groups that are sort of, I don't know, formed around assumptions or ideologies that sort of appeal at a certain stage, and that stage becomes, I would say, resistant to seeing members grow. And there are certain like things about the ideology that can't be questioned, and so they hold a certain cage around the mind. The question then becomes, do you think it's possible for models of group development to like inform that process, and maybe inform group design? And if so, if you
well, can you unpack what you mean by models of group development just a little bit here?
Well, we have some kind of understanding of individual development, and we don't have many models for it, but we have some to say it takes certain steps to go through a developmental process. You just need certain ones to follow others or to precede others for them to be able to happen. The same could probably be intuited about group development, and it's not clear what those particular steps are, but it would be a curiosity to model them, and there are not that many models yet. In fact, only one that I'm aware of, and I was curious if there are others that you might be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area I haven't looked into for a while, and like specifically group development and the way you're speaking of it, though I do think there's a lot of there. I mean, for one, I think that it's going to be difficult for groups to develop that much farther than the larger macro society that they're embedded in, for the same reason that it's difficult for individuals to develop farther than the groups that they're embedded in. Not impossible, or else development would never happen, but difficult, right? You know, there's this phrase, I forget who said it, but I've always liked, that poets are the antenna of the race, meaning humanity. And so I think that, you know, the sort of poet role, the sort of shaman role, there's a sort of role where you stand at the interface between the known and the unknown. And this is not a role that calls to everyone, and it's not a role that everyone who is called to it will be particularly successful with, because there's a strong correlation there between poets and shamans and madmen, right? And you know, that's a high risk life path, so to speak, right? But healthy cultures tends to value those people and help provide for them. Healthy groups tend to value those people and help provide for them. And I do think that that's something important that we can look at in terms of the group versus individual developmental dynamics is, can the group hold a sort of space at its edge for people who might start disagreeing with the group? And again, this is the tension part of the tensegrity, right? To bring in new injunctions, say, hey guys, try this, and have people try it and give some respect, even if a lot of those experiments don't work out, right? I mean, this is, if we look at say society-wide dynamics in our culture, I think, say, the Silicon Valley startup ecosystem is an interesting example of something sort of adjacent to this, because there's this, normally in the business world, it's extremely risk averse. We're extremely short term in terms of our profit expectations, all yada, 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 right? But you look at Silicon Valley and you essentially have an ecosystem of people who mainly throw away money to things that they mainly expect to fail. And yet we've gotten incredible advances out of that dynamic. And so that's sort of like the poet aspect or the shaman aspect, the people on the edge aspect of our current broader business macro culture. And it's provided incredible value to the rest of us by having that be a thing that actually happens. So I think that, you know, being aware of the fact that people that are a bit crazy don't fit in very well often make some of the most valuable contributions, and applying that insight to the group level as well. You know, like maybe one way this manifests is, you know, I've kind of talked about cult dynamics in the negative, but, you know, maybe just, okay, maybe there's such a thing as harmless cults. Maybe we don't have to be so anti-cult, as long as we keep an eye on them and make sure that they're not getting too abusive, but maybe let people do things that we don't personally resonate with and that seem a little bit too far on one side of the dynamic or the other to us. And, you know, we get a sort of field for group dynamic evolution, because I think we've really reached the about as far as we can get, you know, maybe a local maximum in terms of how we organize groups according to what our society agrees is acceptable, right? And we're going to have to move beyond that in some direction, reframe our expectations a little bit in order to move away from this local maximum in terms of group dynamic organization.
Any follow-up, Rob?
Yeah, I'm trying to decide which way I want to take that, because it was all connecting for me. But I think it's, the curiosity for me then is like, how, if you want these different ways of experimenting to proliferate and to have enough freedom to do that authentically and actually find the answers from their experiments, how, I guess, do you anticipate for the fact that some of those things, some of those like wide divergences can breed the toxicity that we know is also attendant to like psychopathy in an individual, that you could create like a petri dish for that sort of thing to just proliferate and get sort of cultural like cancer out of an extremist group or something? So we want to be aware of like the limits on those cases. How do we, I don't know, how do we like field them enough creativity to actually do the evolution they need to do, but give constraints that can offer society safety?
You know, I'm honestly a little bit less worried about safety in this context, maybe than a lot of people are. And I'll tell you why, because I think this already happened, this dynamic that we're talking about. You want to talk about, say, the era roughly corresponding to the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, right? Which is when society as a whole began its transition from the previous stage, right? Stage 3 to stage 4, if we're looking at a sort of Keegan lens here, right? And there were tons of little petri dishes, all kinds of experiments, all kinds of stuff was tried, different organizational forms, different social forms, different religious, and, you know, et cetera, right? All of that was happening in a big way, say from like 1500 to 1700 roughly. And we actually already had the bad thing happen that you're describing. Our entire culture now has been colonized by one of those experiments, which has led to predictable existential risks. So we're already in about as bad a situation as we could possibly be as a species there. So I don't honestly see the risk to reward ratio of future experimentation being any worse than just allowing the status quo to continue. So I'm going to kind of dodge the question in that way.
All right. Let's end on a question dodge. Evan, could you set us up for next week, last session?
Yeah, so next week is going to be probably the most experimental and speculative session of this whole series. The topic is bridging science and magic. So we're going to be returning to the frame of virtualism, and we're going to be looking at what implications this has for things that normally fall under the rubric of magic, right? What sort of interesting abilities, powers, skills, cognitive reframes, etc., can we perhaps appreciate as being somewhat real? How can we engage with some of this stuff we've been talking about in the bridge and go a little bit beyond what our current culture's concept of science says is possible? How can we explore the edge of the possible using some of these tools, and we can see what magic might be out there? And like I said, this is speculative, mainly based on personal experience, and I'm just going to offer what I've got there, and I think it'll be an interesting conversation. I encourage everybody to come armed with their own experiences in that domain of the more bizarre aspects of our phenomenological histories, and we can just go from there and see what emerges.
Beautiful. So let's plug upcoming events. Evan, do you want to talk about the one that you're hosting later today?
Yeah, so for people that have been interested in this session, I think most of you would probably be interested in the session that we're having today at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with Daniel Ingram. So the session title is Researching the Scientific and Clinical Implications of Emergence. And we're going to be talking about Daniel Ingram's new project, the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, which is a coalition of researchers dedicated to bringing some light on science, spirituality, and how they relate to clinical practice on a global scale. So in essence, no longer misclassifying spiritual experience as psychosis, and all kinds of other interesting topics in that area. So I think that'd be of great interest to most of the people here, and encourage everyone to attend.
And that is at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, so in 90 minutes. The link's right there. We have a session on Rene Girard tomorrow, how he helps us understand our world from one of his leading scholars. And then Existential Kink is back at the STOA. That's on Wednesday. I'm excited about that. And there's going to be a lot of cool events happening. So, for example, Daniel Ingram and Frank Yang agreed to be in conversation in the Dialogos. So we're going to have all these interesting Dialogos. I think we're going to call it like Steal the Culture with Dialogos or something. It's all these combinations you've never seen before will be happening at the STOA in 2021. That being said, hope to see everyone soon. Thanks for coming to the STOA.